Hey Sagittarius, this is your year ahead horoscope for the entire year of 2026. So joining me today is astrologer Leisa Schaim. I'm Chris Brennan from the Astrology podcast, and we're going to look at the entire year ahead and look at the major transits coming up over the next 12 months. So hey Lisa, thanks for joining me for horoscopes this year.
Hey Chris, glad to be here.
Yeah, we have been doing these. We have a lot of stuff to talk about, so why don't we just go ahead and jump right into it? So, our horoscopes are primarily for those that have Sagittarius rising, and we recommend looking at the one that matches your rising sign if you know your birth time. Although, if you don't know your birth time, then you can also look at the one that matches your sun sign. So, let's jump right into it. So, here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and where they will end up by the end of the year. And here are the major transits we're going to be talking about for those watching the video version with some of the dates involved. So the first major transit that takes place in 2026 is that the planets Saturn and Neptune, which are slow-moving outer planets, are finally departing from the sign of Pisces, which is your fourth house of home and living situation and parents, and they're going to move into Aries starting in January and February, which is your fifth house of children, hobbies, fun and games, and sex and sexuality. So this is a major shift that takes place right at the beginning of the year.
Yeah, so this is going to really alleviate some kind of potentially hard work, constraint, or nebulousness that's been going on in your home sector, especially since March 2023, since Saturn moved in there. And with Neptune transiting your fourth house ever since 2011, there can be some sort of nebulousness around like where is home or some feelings of uncertainty about home life. And the really good thing about these two moving out of that sector is that now your home and living situation area, as well as things having to do with your parents, just home-based foundations for your life, are going to be a lot more clear, especially with Neptune leaving there.
Yeah, for sure. So there may have been some obstacles that came up in terms of your home and living situation, especially since March of 2023 when Saturn first moved into your fourth house. But some of that is going to be cleared up, as well as potentially some issues in terms of your parents or your family that was also coming up since that time, which will start to dissipate as Saturn moves out of that sign. So that's pretty good news. So Saturn and Neptune are moving into your fifth house, though, which for those of you that have children, sometimes this can bring on greater responsibility when it comes to children, and some issues can arise at this time that require greater responsibility. So for some people, that could become things like, becoming parents and dealing with some of the greater responsibility or some of the issues in terms of energy expenditure and other things like that, and how to maintain good health while also having that, huge energy expenditure.
Definitely. It can also be a time when if you already have children, whether they're young children or older, that can be a time when they need more support from you or more help. It can also be a time where there's greater seriousness around your love life. So it tends to be a time where romance-wise, it's not as lighthearted. It's not to say that there can't be romance, but there can be greater seriousness or constraint around it. You can be taking it more seriously. You do want to be careful, especially around February when Saturn and Neptune exactly conjoin there in your fifth house. Around romance in particular, I would say there can be a need to separate like what's real from what's fantasy or what's rose-colored glasses from what's actually happening in a romantic situation.
Yeah, definitely. I've been calling it the reality distortion field peaking with the Saturn Neptune conjunction. It's been building up over the past few years, but it really hits its most intense in February. And it's going to be hard to tell the difference between what's real versus what's not, which has been, happening in like the technology sphere with like AI generated video and things like that. But this is also impacting each of us personally in different areas of our life. And for some reason, it's hitting the like children, romance, sex and sexuality sector. So definitely thinking about that in terms of sometimes not being able to tell the difference between what's true versus what's false. And so sometimes if there's something that might like seem too good to be true in this time, there's a good chance that it might be. So that it might be important to avoid making super important decisions until that conjunction has started to move away after February, at which point some things might start to become a little bit clearer.
Right. And one additional note, especially if you're someone who does any sort of creative work, this can be really put to good use. for creative projects because artistry can be one of the more positive Neptunian significations. And so it can be a time where you're like putting new efforts or new longer term efforts towards a creative project and making it real.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned the sex and sexuality piece, and I think that's important because sometimes when Saturn goes through your fifth house, it can just be a period in which you're putting less emphasis on that area of your life for some reason, or you're feeling like less interest in that area for some reason, or maybe there's some issues that arise that cause you to slow down more in that area compared to other times in your life. And sometimes that's what a Saturn transit's about. And there was a preview of this transit already last year because Saturn went into Aries and into your fifth house starting in June, I think, of 2025 for several months before it retrograded out and went back into Pisces in September. So if you can think back to some of the things that started to arise during that time around the middle portion of last year of 2025, that should give you a little bit of a preview or idea of what's coming up with this longer term transit with Saturn going in there starting in January and February.
Mhm.
So that is our first major transit of the year for 2026. Let's move on to our second one, which is the first eclipse season takes place from February through March. And this one's happening in the signs of Aquarius and Virgo, which is your third house of communication, short distance travel, and extended relatives, including siblings, and your 10th house of career, reputation, and overall life direction.
Yeah, so this is going to be the first Aquarius eclipse in that series of Aquarius Leo eclipses. So the first one happening in your third house, which can bring important beginnings and endings with regard to things surrounding your siblings, whether that's your connection with your siblings or something happening that's an important beginning or ending in their lives. Similarly, with extended relatives, cousins, etc., there can be beginnings and endings with regard to neighbors or your immediate neighborhood. And you could get either more or less involved in your neighborhood for some reason. It can also be a time of important beginnings or endings with regard to communication. So you could start like a new podcast. You could start communicating differently. You could start learning a new language. You could start writing something. Books are a good third house topic. Yeah. So just important beginnings and endings with regard to any of those topics.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of this may accelerate some changes and transformations that have been happening in this area since 2022 and 2023 when Pluto first moved into Aquarius, since we're now having this eclipse take place there and magnify some of that and bringing this weightier element of major beginnings and major endings to that sector of your life. The primary way that the third house affects all of us, as Lisa said, is just through communication. So that's the primary one to think about in terms of how you communicate and whether there's some new start or new beginning to communication that starts around the time of this eclipse that will turn out to be more important than it might seem at first, because this eclipse is the first in a series of them that's going to be bouncing back and forth between your third house of communication and your ninth house of education and learning and wisdom. So it's going to be part of this ongoing dialogue between learning new things and expanding your horizons in terms of your beliefs and your education, but then also learning how to communicate those things that you've learned that are new things and how to sometimes you learn things best by like learning how to teach them to somebody else. So that's part of the dynamic here with this first eclipse.
Definitely. And I also just want to throw in transportation because it's a common thing that comes up in the third house. With eclipses there can be beginnings or endings with regard to how you get around in your short distance travel, i.e. cars come up a lot. It can be any sort of mode of transportation that's like a sudden change.
Yeah, sometimes an eclipse in the third house could be like a mode of transportation coming to an end, like a car stops working or something like that, and you have to get a new one. So then it represents a major ending and major beginning when it comes to that idea of transportation. So
Mhm.
that's the third house part, but the other part of this is that 10th house eclipse happening in the career sector of your chart, which is also representing major beginnings and major endings in terms of your overall life direction. And sometimes this can be things like ending work with a certain career or a certain job so that you can then start a new one, or sometimes like having a door closed in terms of your path and what you thought your career, where you thought your career was headed, but then as a result of that being pushed in a new direction that ends up being fruitful in terms of opening up a new career path for you at this time.
Definitely. And we're in the middle of that eclipse series. So there have been a couple more in 2025 previous to this, and there'll be one more in early 2027. So this is something that's already underway. Some changes happening with regard to your career, professional life, how you're publicly known. It can also be when it's not a change to your actual career direction or role. Sometimes supervisors can come or leave because that's also a 10th house topic.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so that's our second thing. Let's move into our next major transit, which is that the planet Gemini is wrapping up a 7 year long transit through the
Uranus.
sign of, Gemini, Taurus, whatever.
Planets.
Uh, the planet Uranus is wrapping up a long-term transit through the sign of Taurus that began in 2018 and 2019, which was going through your sixth house of work and health. And starting in April, Uranus is going to move into the sign of Gemini, which is your seventh house of relationships. So this is a major, major shift because Uranus represents sudden, sometimes unexpected changes. It also represents liberation and an internal drive for freedom and doing things in a way that's new and different and exciting. And this energy is being imported into your seventh house of relationships and partnership, where it's manifesting at this time and where it's opening up a new chapter that's going to last through most of the rest of this decade.
Definitely. So the first 4 months of the year, Uranus will be at the tail end of Taurus. And in February, there'll be kind of a last hurrah with regard to that transit in your area of work and health, just because Uranus will station and then a bunch of inner planets will activate that all month. But then it moves into your seventh house of partnership, which can be personal or business partnership. And that's a 7 year transit that can be particularly exciting with regard to relationships. Um, Romantic relationships in particular can suddenly start or suddenly end, or there can be this little stop-go erratic quality to it. But it can be a time where you're more open to meeting all different kinds of people, like very quickly, suddenly, like there's no real reserve around it. It kind of speeds up the process.
Yeah. So if you're single, then sometimes you can attract a relationship or get into a relationship with somebody who's different, like radically different than any one you've ever been in a relationship with, and who might surprise you in terms of being something that you normally wouldn't be into, but all of a sudden you find out that you are. Alternatively, if you're already in a significant relationship, then sometimes there can be unexpected changes that are happening with your partner where they're going through something that's changing them radically in a way that's different and unexpected, but where they're trying to be more authentic to themselves. And sometimes in that process, you have to negotiate that as a couple and decide if that's something that you want to stick around for, or whether the changes they are going through are too radical for you so that you end up having to go your own way.
Right. And Uranus transits through the seventh are also really well known for needing to give more space to your partner, or to whatever they're going through. Sometimes literal geographical space. Sometimes it's just like more psychological space for them to, be doing their individuating thing that they're doing. But some sort of greater space is usually called for during this time, and it usually goes better if you're already in a relationship, if you can kind of allow for that.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was already a preview of this transit last year, starting in July of 2025, when Uranus first moved into Gemini for a few months before it retrograded back out and went back into Taurus. So think back to that middle part of the year from July forward, and you should have gotten like a little bit of preview of what was going on with the relationship sector of your life and some of the changes that that would have foreshadowed at that time. But starting in April, we're just like in that all the way until 2032 and 2033, which is how long it's going to take before Uranus completes that transit and departs from Gemini.
hmm
All right, so let's move on to our next major transit, which is that the planet Jupiter, the planet of growth and optimism, is going to spend the first 6 months of the year moving through the sign of Cancer, which is your eighth house of shared resources and other people's money. But then starting in late June, Jupiter's going to move into the sign of Leo for the entire second half of the year, which is your ninth house of education, philosophy, beliefs, and travel. And this is one of the better transits this year, and one of the ones that's more distinctive because it basically divides the first half of the year versus the second half of the year.
Right. So with Jupiter transiting in your eighth house, that's a transit that started in the middle of 2025. And so we're getting the second half of that transit in the first half of 2026. So it's a time of greater expansion with regard to anything where you share resources or finances with another person, whether that's a personal relationship or a business partnership. It's a time where you can expand that, those shared resources. It can be a time where you gain some sort of money from other people, whether that's something like grants, scholarships, inheritance, things of that nature. There can also be expansion in the other financial topics like having to do more around taxes, loans, or debt, whether that's restructuring that or something. Um, and then, yeah, it's interesting for some people. I know this won't be for everyone, but for some people, with it going through the eighth house and then the ninth house, that could be like money for school.
Yeah, for sure. Like getting a loan or something like that, that would make sense. Yeah, especially for the people that were born during the day with a day chart, the potential for this for being some sort of like financial windfall or growth that comes about as a result of another person or another entity outside of you would be a common manifestation of this transit. But moving into the second half of it, the Jupiter in the ninth house can be really good for travel and either expanding your horizons physically by like traveling to a different country or a place you haven't visited before and being exposed to new cultures and new like customs that are different from what you grew up with. Or sometimes Jupiter transits through the ninth house can be like travel through the mind, through going back to school and getting into a new education program, getting really interested in something that suddenly fascinates you, that you decide to throw yourself into and learn a lot about. And sometimes this can be preparatory because this is a year-long transit of Jupiter through your ninth house, starting in the second half of 2026, going into the second half of 2027. And sometimes whatever you learn during that year-long transit, you can end up applying to career matters a year later when Jupiter starts going through your 10th house of career, starting in mid 2027.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think this will feel like a lot more sense of freedom for Sagittarius rising people because you're having Saturn leave your fourth house. Usually people with strong Sagittarian factors in their chart, like the feeling of freedom, like the opportunity to move about, to expand their horizons, not to be kind of like stuck or constrained. And so Saturn's leaving your fourth house of home where you're not having to put so much effort into that grounding area of your life, your foundations. And now you get to expand in the ninth house, which has some affinity with the sign of Sagittarius, even though they're not the same. You get to expand your horizons in whichever ways you'd like in terms of either physical travel, as you said, or mental explorations, expanding your belief systems, learning about, new ways of seeing the world. It's kind of like a very optimistic, expansive feeling.
Yeah, and this is really going to be the area of your life that has the most activity in the second half of the year, because this is actually the first of three transits that are happening in your ninth house. So I think this idea of expanding your mind and expanding your horizons and traveling either literally or metaphorically is going to dominate the second half of 2027, all the 2026, all the way into 2027.
Mhm.
So speaking of the Jupiter transits, a really nice one that we saw that is happening in June, just before Jupiter moves out of Cancer, is the planet Venus is going to come up and form a very auspicious conjunction with Jupiter in Cancer just before Jupiter leaves that sign. And that's the one that's happening in the eighth house. So that could be, for some people, like the trigger of like the financial windfall thing we were talking about earlier with the eighth house. But we actually noticed this because we just finished researching and released our 2026 Electional Astrology report, where we went through and highlighted the best dates that are the most fortunate in 2026 using the principles of electional astrology.
Yeah, so basically, any important actions you want to take in 2026, new projects you want to start, whether it's things around your love life, business, home, or what have you, if you use these dates and times that we've already selected, it'll to start those things, it'll have better odds of successful results.
Yeah, and in the report, we go through each of the next 12 months and we give a forecast of the general astrological weather, but we also tell you not just what dates to start things, but also what dates to avoid. Because sometimes with electional astrology, it's just as important to know which dates are bad dates for doing things as it is knowing which dates are good dates for doing things. So the report includes a video as well as an audio and written version of the report that's very extensive and detailed. There's 28 auspicious electional dates to choose from, including tutorials on how to use those charts, and you can use them for business, love, or pretty much any major life event next year. So the report's on sale for a launch sale for $49.95, but only for the first month, and then the price is going to go up in January to $65. So you should get the report now while it's still on sale at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. All right, so that takes us into the second half of the year. Let's get back to the transits, where the next one we want to talk about is the second eclipse season begins and takes place in the month of August and trails over a little bit into early September, where there's going to be an eclipse in the sign of Leo, which is your ninth house again, and then another eclipse that happens 2 weeks after that in the sign of Pisces, which is your fourth house of home and living situation.
Yeah, so that first one is the very first eclipse in the Leo series, and that'll happen in your ninth house of greater exploration of body or mind, whether that's physical exploration or mental exploration. As we were just talking about, it's the same area where that Jupiter transit is for the second half of the year. So this brings an important beginning or ending with regard to one or more of those topics. It's going to be really an area of concentration for you in the second half of 2026 because we've got the Jupiter transit, the eclipse there, and then we'll have another transit we'll talk about in a bit. So it's something where you're going to be putting a lot of focus on that area, whether that's beginning or ending, going to school for something that could be universities, beginning or ending. Some sort of travel that you're planning, beginning or ending some serious study, whether even if it's informal and on your own. Yeah, so those sorts of topics.
Yeah, so this eclipse in Leo brings a weightiness to the Jupiter transit we were talking about there earlier about growth and expansion, about expanding your horizons. Having eclipses start taking place in the same sign means that this isn't just like growth and expansion and having luck and like good fortune in that area in this year, but you start doing something that's important for your overall life direction. And that's going to be much more important in terms of wrapping something up and ending something in this area, such as ending an educational program where, for example, some people graduate at this time. But it's also laying a new foundation in this area that's going to affect not just your overall life direction, but also your core and fundamental beliefs and outlook about the world, which can include your religion, your philosophy, and other things of that nature about who you think you are and what you think you're doing here, or what you think we're all doing here, and what this is all about. This eclipse will really start bringing that into focus, and it ties back into the earlier eclipse that I mentioned from earlier this year that takes place in your third house in the February-March timeframe, because there's going to be this back and forth motion between you learning new things and expanding your horizons, but also having to find new ways to communicate those things you've learned in order to express this new outlook that you're starting to develop. And that's really going to start to come into focus with this eclipse happening in August in your ninth house.
Mhm. And then the next eclipse will be the last Pisces eclipse in a series of eclipses that's already been happening for quite a while. And this will be kind of a point of closure, potentially at least for a lot of people with that fourth house of home and family area, because you've had that Saturn transit for the last few years there, Neptune transiting, both of those are leaving, and then this series of eclipses, prior eclipses in that same area. So there'll be some sort of concluding point, and a sort of one last important beginning or ending with regard to home, family, things with parents or ancestry. And it's kind of interesting thinking about that interplaying with the ninth house eclipse so close together, because at least for some people, I get a feeling of like, okay, things are settled at home and now I can go explore more.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do like how this is the first one after Saturn and Neptune have departed from that area and have freed up some of the heaviness that we've been experiencing with Saturn transiting the fourth house of home and parents since 2023. And now all of a sudden we have a final eclipse in order to bring to conclusion and put some sort of final ending on the sequence of events that's been developing in that area for 3 years now in our life. So for some of you, that's going to be a ending when it comes to a living situation set up in terms of like maybe you've been living in some place for a period of time, but that starts to wind down and you have to move to a new place. So it's like, putting an ending on that in terms of saying goodbye to the current living situation and looking back and reflecting on it, but then also picking out and being very deliberate about moving to a new place. And sometimes when you do something like that, it can seem like a minor thing at first when you move to a new location and maybe you're thinking that it's just like temporary or something. But then sometimes when you do things like that on an eclipse, it turns out that that was actually a huge move and a huge turning point in your life when you look back in retrospect at that many years later.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's also relevant in terms of parents, in terms of some sort of ending and new beginning when it comes to something happening in their life or something in terms of your relationship with them. So that'll be interesting and important to pay attention to as well. All right, so that's eclipse season. The next transit I want to talk about is the Venus retrograde that takes place in the signs of Scorpio and Libra in October and November, where Venus is going to go retrograde in your 12th house, and then it's going to retrograde back into your 11th house of friends and groups. So this is a little bit tricky because it's connecting two areas of your chart that are very different, where the 12th house tends to represent like on the one hand, enemies and people that you don't get along with in your life, but then it crosses over and Venus goes into your 11th house, which is the place of friends and groups. So sometimes how it's connecting these two topics of like enemies and friends in ways that don't usually cross over, but for some reason it's forming some sort of connection here in your life at this time.
Yeah, so for some people, that can be like revisiting and trying to provide eventual greater clarity on like who is actually a friend and who is not. Sometimes that can happen whether when there's a retrograde connection between the 12th and 11th houses. For other people, the initial Venus retrograde through the 12th house can be a time where you're secluding yourself more. You may be having social moments behind the scenes, but not really outwardly otherwise. You're not like socializing in big groups. And then all of a sudden, when Venus retrogrades back into your 11th, you do revisit connections with either old friends that you haven't heard from for a while for whatever reason, pop back up. Sometimes that can happen with Venus retrograding through your 11th house of groups and friends, or you can reconnect with organizations that you've been involved with in the past. It can be just a time, anytime, especially when Venus retrogrades through some sort of social house, which the 11th house is for you. It's a time of reevaluating not only old relationships that can come up with friends or groups, but also reevaluating how you connect with your friends or reevaluating the friendships that you do have in your life and trying to decide, do things need to change or, are they good? That's a typical Venus retrograde evaluation.
Yeah, I like that. And this can actually be quite positive, especially for those of you with night charts. This might actually be one of the most positive transits of the year. And because it's a retrograde, Venus retrogrades always have this backwards looking orientation where you're looking back to situations and oftentimes people from the past that come back into your life into the present. And to get a preview of this transit, you can actually think back 8 years earlier because Venus retrogrades repeat in the same spot in the zodiac in our birth charts every 8 years around the same time of the year. So, for example, 8 years ago would have been October and November of 2018 when Venus was again retrograded in Scorpio and Libra, or 8 years before that, which would have been in 2010, for example. So, think back to that area, and sometimes that'll clue you in on some of the major changes and some of the situations that might come up again and arise when it comes to these topics in your life. All right, so let's transition into talking about the last transit of the year, which is going to be this Mars retrograde that's building up and entering into its shadow period starting in the last few months of the year, starting in late September. So, this is going to be a Mars retrograde in the signs of Leo and Virgo, and the retrograde doesn't actually start until January of 2027 when Mars stations retrograde in Virgo, but Mars has already entered into those two signs that it's going to go retrograde in by late September. And as a result of that, Mars is going to be spending a lot of time in those two signs and in two specific houses of your chart, which is the ninth house of education and travel and philosophy and beliefs, and the 10th house of career and reputation and overall life direction.
Right. So this is going to be the same overlapping area that the Jupiter transit goes through in the second half of the year, and the Leo eclipse happens in that we both of which we mentioned. So this is obviously going to be a really clear area of focus for you in the second half of 2026. And it's already slowing down in the last quarter of 2026. And so spending longer, even in that first bit, it's spending 2 months instead of 6 weeks, for instance, in that ninth house, and so forth. So it's already slowing down and taking more time in those areas of your life. And what that means is you're going to be putting a lot more energy or effort for some reason into the ninth house of either higher education or long distance travel, exploring other cultures or other belief systems, or just putting more work into, say, if you do astrology, like your astrology work. And then it's going to go into your 10th house of career and public reputation. And one of the things you can do with that transit is notice the things that are coming up for you during that time, because some of it will need to be reworked and take a little longer than you're potentially expecting because of that impending retrograde in the beginning of 2027. So you can kind of get clues as it goes forward as to, what is potentially going to need more work going forward. But it can be a great time to put a lot of energy or effort into study that goes towards your career, or teaching that is intertwined with your career, or just learning new skills that you can apply to your career. It can also, though, be a time of greater tensions or conflict when it comes to those areas of life.
Yeah, so we saw during the last Mars retrograde last year a lot of times where there was this connection between the two houses that the Mars retrograde went between, where it would connect those house topics. So here, some of the connections are like a connection between travel and work, for example, or a connection between education and training versus work, or even between like your beliefs versus your workplace and your bosses or superior. And therein could be some of the tension is on the one hand, especially for people with night charts, this will probably just be a more constructive transit of sustained energy and working up very hard in this area of your life, especially career wise. But for people with night charts, or sorry, for people with day charts, it could be a little bit more problematic because it could be something where it's connecting those two areas in a way that creates strife or tension or difficulties. So, for example, the ninth house can be about your religious beliefs, but also about your political beliefs as well. So there could be some sort of conflict in the workplace that arises as a result of your beliefs at some fundamental level, and some issue in terms of blurring the boundary between those two areas, creating difficulties or setbacks for some reason.
Yeah, that's a potential for sure. And more so for the day chart people, as you said. But then conversely, the day chart people will also have Jupiter transiting the ninth house as well for the second half of the year. So you'll get a little bit more of the extremes. So like problems, more problems cropping up, but also greater positive results happening at the same time for some reason. Whereas for the night chart people with that transit, it's a little bit more moderated in both directions towards the middle.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this is the house that we're just focusing on all year. And even though it could be a challenging transit that comes up, we also have that really positive transit happening simultaneously, as well as the eclipse that happened in August, which is showing that there's very weighty things that are happening that are impacting the overall life direction, even though it's happening within the context of the ninth house of travel and beliefs and education and things like that. So again, this is a transit that really is most intense actually in the first part of 2027, but there's just some build up to it that's happening here that I think is going to be important to pay attention to because sometimes we can initiate things that don't seem super important at first or like they should last for very long, but then all of a sudden during a retrograde, they just get dragged out and end up taking much longer than we expect.
Yeah, that's a pretty classic way that Mars retrogrades play out. So, whatever you're starting during the last quarter of 2026 or putting a lot of energy towards, just know that it will take a little bit longer than you're potentially anticipating.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I think that's the last transit that we wanted to talk about today in terms of your forecast for 2026. So those are your major transits. Like we said, if you need help planning important things and dates next year, then you can get our electional astrology report for 2026. The launch sale is just $49.95, but only this month until January, and then it goes up to $65. So you can get that now at theastrologypodcast.com/2026 report. And otherwise, if you want to learn more about our approach to astrology and how we read birth charts, you can check out my Hellenistic astrology course, which is available at theastrologyschool.com. All right, good luck in 2026, and we'll see you again next year.